Corruptions and false dichotomies in modern spiritual practices, left-hand path versus the right-hand path. Anyone interested in learning about esotericism, the occult, the paranormal, or anything supernatural, will quickly realize there are two main schools of thought, if you will. Just like how, in American politics, there are the Republicans and the Democrats, so too in the occult world there are two main quote-unquote factions, if you can call it that. On the one hand, you have what's called the left-hand path. On the other, the right-hand path. Although both terms originally extend out of India, they have since taken on a more different meaning in the modern, Western world, and I will be using these definitions for the rest of this video. So what are these two schools of thought? What's the difference between the left-hand path and the right-hand path, and which one is correct? Well, as it turns out, both are false. Both the modern left-hand path, as well as the modern right-hand path, are corruptions and false dichotomies. Neither is a reflection of healthy spirituality, each having a kernel of truth, but laced with misunderstandings and distortions. It's just like how both the Republican and Democrat parties are controlled opposition, both working for Jewish interests in a Hegelian dialectic, playing off each other in order to keep the goyim divided and ignorant of the genuine third position. These types of false dichotomies are a staple tactic used by the New World Order. For example, you have feminism and MGTOW, both are unhealthy extremes. Another dichotomy is either being a degenerate, promiscuous, hypersexual person, or the other extreme, becoming a celibate monk who rejects sexuality altogether. How about being either a hippie, communist environmentalist, or a ruthless industrialist capitalist that doesn't care for the environment? Or being either a vegan, or a carnivore? All of these are just the many examples of false dichotomies that the Jews and their New World Order puppets use to keep you enslaved, and stuck on their plantation. In the same way, modern spirituality falls into the same problem. Forget about Christianity and Islam, which are obvious slave religions created by the Jews. See my earlier videos on Christian terrorism. Even the so-called occult spiritual traditions are still corrupted and distorted into a false dichotomy. For example, the left-hand path is typically considered more evil or dark, whereas the right-hand path is considered more light or noble. Similar to the Jedi and the Sith, the left-hand path would be considered more selfish, focused on fulfilling her selfish desires and otherwise an expression of individuality. What exactly constitutes left-hand path practices? Well, here you'll find things such as chaos magic, Lavian Satanism, Blavatsky's Theosophy, Aleister Crowley, and other groups such as the Order of the Golden Dawn. You will also find modern-day demonology, ceremonial magic, Freemasonry, etc., included in left-hand path practices as well. The problem is, anyone that knows anything about these things can tell you that they are either 1. Designed to turn people into degenerates and drug addicts, or 2. Laced with Hebrew symbols that latches non-Jews into the Talmudic matrix. Aleister Crowley was a degenerate who spent 10 years of his life learning Jewish magic from the Order of the Golden Dawn alongside another Jewish occultist named Israel Regardie. Afterwards, Crowley ended up being hired by the British Zionist government during World War II in order to fight against the German occult groups such as the Vril Society, which were having tremendous success locating submarines and other secret military assets, bases. Interestingly enough, Crowley was quite unsuccessful, with multiple of his associates that participated in occult rituals against the Third Reich getting sick and dying days after. So, let me ask you, why would you want to learn magic from someone who was a degenerate and Zionist agent? Someone who directly fought against the Third Reich in the secret occult war of World War II. Why are his books so popular and pushed amongst book publishers? You can ask the same question about Madame Blavatsky. She is someone that, in the mainstream press, is portrayed as being a masterful occultist and researcher. On the surface, her work does seem rather impressive, and there's definitely good information that can be salvaged from her works. However, once you start diving deeper into the surface of her writings, you start to see the traces of poison imbued into these works. I won't go too long into this subject, as it requires another video, but Blavatsky's Theosophy is essentially, at its core, a form of Christian mysticism. She describes how Jesus was the, quote-unquote, grand philosopher and moral reformer, considering Jesus to be, quote, the great teacher as well as an avatar, with great healing abilities as well as the power to exorcise, as she calls, demons. Already, this sounds incredibly close to Christianity. Blavatsky believes that there was a real, Hebrew Jesus who had great powers and was a great person. What she does not know, however, was that the Jesus story was largely a fabrication of various other Aryan gods at the time, Dionysus, Horus, Odin, etc., to make the story more appealing, but laced with poisonous ideologies to weaken Europeans, subconsciously worship the Jewish race, as well as ultimately destroy our own occult and spiritual systems. There are Jewish groups, such as the Therapeutes, which use their wealth and their connections to create Christianity as a poisonous mushroom to destroy Rome and Greece. I could do a whole video on the topic, but here's a revealing quote from Macarius in his great books, The Sons of God, begin quote. According to the legend, the Septuagint had been translated by Alexandrian Jews, who were doubtlessly the predecessors of the Therapeutes, as the possession of such scriptures would very unlikely be in the hands of any other group. Eusebius is certainly correct in his assertions regarding the Therapeutian texts, as he is likewise correct that this Hebrew Jewish community was the wellspring from which Christianity emanated. There were a number of Jewish brotherhoods, several of whom believed that they were God's elect and that salvation would come through them. Their principle of salvation, Yeshua, was the Messiah, Christos, and in the Jewish communities influenced by the Greek culture this Messiah was depicted not as a warrior but as a spiritual and mystical entity. In this way, not only would the Romans and Greeks themselves be overthrown, but so too would be their gods, replaced by the Jewish tribal god Yahweh. These various Jewish sects were intent on creating a philosophy or religion that would manipulate the Gentiles in the monotheism of Judaism and away from idolatry, or polytheism, with the awareness that those who held the keys to a monotheistic God would dominate in religion and culture in general. End quote. It's clear that Madame Blavatsky had no understanding of the truth about Christianity or Jesus, as well as how Jewish groups created this belief system to push onto the Goyim. But it gets worse than that. Blavatsky also goes on to write about various subjects, incorporating Jewish Kabbalah into her theosophical works. Again, this is the same Jewish magic that proclaims the Jews will rule over the world and all the Gentiles will be enslaved to them. Why would you, as a non-Jew, want to connect yourself to this Jewish poison? Things get worse. Blavatsky's writings also stress that there were several root races in the past, Atlantean, Lemurian, etc., although I believe these were still what you would call Proto-Aryans. Blavatsky goes on to say that the current root race, the fifth root race, the Aryan, will eventually need to disappear for the upcoming sixth root race. This already sounds really suspect, that the Aryan race needs to, quote-unquote, disappear, for society to advance. However, things get even worse when you read the direct quotes Blavatsky made on the Jews. Here are some direct quotes from her, quote, "Of all cruel bigots, the Spanish Catholics have, perhaps, earned the most shameful reputation. Their savagery towards the Jews makes a dark blot upon the history of the race." Here's another quote, "I have studied the Kabbalah under two learned rabbis, one of whom was an initiate. I shall only show what the Tetragrammaton is said to be in the Zohar, and as explained to the writer personally by a Hebrew initiated rabbi, in Palestine and made very plain to every advanced Kabbalist." And yet another, quote, "Let him inquire, and he will find that we have a number of Jews in our society, both in America, Europe and here, and that many of our valued and most intelligent friends are Jews." Or perhaps most damning of them all, quote, "Anti-Semitism of itself, of course, is an excellent example of mass paranoia." Blavatsky would go on to say that the Jews are just as Aryan as the Europeans, blatantly false, even among the more European mixed Ashkenazi Jews. Their Jewish DNA, including specific Jewish DNA genes such as the Levi and Cohen genes, make them completely different from Europeans. I could go on for hours. If you want to chuckle, go on Helena Blavatsky's website, and you'll find a hilarious article called The Jewish Esoteric School, where she goes on to say, quote, "For almost 2,000 years, anti-Semitism has been a self-inflicted wound and a disgrace in human civilization. Through the systematic persecution of Jewish nation and tradition, Western culture has deprived itself of some of its greatest treasures, in ethics, in wisdom, humanism, and spirituality." End quote.
You serious?
I think you get the point. Blavatsky is not a pro-white friend at all. In fact, I consider her writings to be perfectly compatible with the Jewish Illuminati, the New World Order, and what the Kabbalistic rabbis want for the Goyim. You can see just how corrupt these quote-unquote left-hand path teachings are, when so much of these teachings stem from Blavatsky's corrupted, Jew-tainted works. It's not surprising that the Third Reich ended up kicking out the Theosophical Society, run by Rudolf Steiner, who had waged an occult war against the Thule and Vril societies before losing handily. Steiner's Theosophical Society was also aiming for a communist-style revolution in Germany, similar to how the Jewish communists that took over Bavaria operated out of the Freemasonic lodges in the area. Let's move on. Other notable left-hand path figures include Anton LaVey. As you all probably know, LaVey, also known as Levine, is a biological Jew. He's also more of an atheist than anything else, and started this rather disgusting fashion of people dressing in black with black makeup thinking they are Satanists and occultists, a rather vile fashion trend altogether, if I may say so. Then you have the various left-hand practices themselves. This includes things such as chaos magic, which the subversive Jew Alexander Dugin promotes, which involves things like masturbating to sigils in order to turn them into thought forms. Chaos magic also encourages the liberal use of drugs. Whatever legitimate information there is in these texts are pretty rudimentary, at best. Other left-hand path practices, such as modern-day demonology, are just as Jewish. Most of these books teach readers to use Hebrew scriptures, calling upon Jewish angels, as well as invoking the name of Yahweh in order to bind these, quote-unquote, demons, these same demons that, in many cases, used to be pagan gods thousands of years ago. This is exactly the same problem with ceremonial magic from groups like the Golden Dawn. They incorporate Jewish and Kabbalistic ideas and notions. As I mentioned before, the Golden Dawn's founder, Israel Regardie, is a Jew. In other words, these left-hand path teachings, for the most part, are encouraging Aryans and non-Jews to either become drug-addicted degenerates, as well as worship Jews and attach themselves to the Jewish energetic vortex. In a sense, there's little difference from being a Christian, where you worship a Jew named Jesus, and being a left-hand path occultists via these types of modalities, which simply use Jewish mysticism. In either sense, you are a puppet to the Kabbalistic rabbis. In fact, I'd argue that the left-hand path is quite similar to political movements such as anarcho-capitalism or extreme, Ayn Rand objectivist individualism. Ayn Rand was a Jew, by the way, and was in a romantic relationship with one of the Rothschilds. Both promote this hyper-individualistic, selfish, dog-eat-dog, craps-in-the-bucket mentality, where the only thing you strive for is competing against your fellow goyim, but failing to realize the importance of your family, your people, your volk, as well as the world. So with that said, how about the right-hand path? If the left-hand path is all corrupt and vile, shouldn't the right-hand path be much better? Not at all. This is the nature of the false Jewish dichotomy. Right-hand path teachings are typically considered more selfless. Here you will find neo-pagan nonsense such as Wicca, but also a lot of Eastern spiritual systems. This would include things like Daoism, Taoism, Buddhism, etc. If the left-hand path is depicted as the dark side and the Sith, if we use Star Wars as a metaphor, then the right-hand path teachings would be closer to the Jedi. Please check out my earlier documentary, Star Wars, What They Don't Want You to Know, for more information on Aryan spiritual messages in the original trilogy. Oftentimes, right-hand path teachings focus more on meditation rather than weird ceremonies and taking drugs. This could include practices such as awakening the Kundalini, breathing exercises, and more. Not surprisingly, I'd say that right-hand path practitioners often have much more genuine occult abilities, at least, at first. However, to understand how these teachings became corrupted, we need to realize that, in the same way Jews used Christianity to destroy Greece and Rome, Jews used Buddhism to destroy the East. The main problem is that these philosophies no longer reflect their original, Aryan teachings. Originally, they were about empowering the soul, achieving powers, and eventually becoming a supreme being. The original Buddha was an alternative name for Votan, with the Druids of England referring to their island as the Isle of Buddha. However, under the Indian Emperor Ashoka, these original Vedic Aryan teachings were destroyed in the same way that Christians destroyed the occult spiritual schools of Rome, Greece, and eventually the Druids. The truth about Ashoka, The Indian emperor that mandated Buddhism across his country is much different than what most people imagine. Ashoka was considered a violent and cruel person. One Chinese visitor commented that Ashoka had his own personal dungeon where he tortured people that got on his nerves. These people would be horrifically tortured to death, with no hope of ever escaping. Ashoka, after solidifying his empire at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers, ended up imposing a new form of spirituality onto his population, banning the original Vedic spiritual teachings completely. This included burning historical libraries, equivalent to the Library of Alexandria, for comparison, as well as executing those that dissented with this rule. The story of Ashoka sounds quite similar to the Roman emperors that mandated Christianity across the empire, while banning paganism. As it turns out, however, both are eerily similar, for more than one reason. Just as how the Christian Roman emperors, including the Flavian dynasty, were funded and run by Jewish oligarchs out of Alexandria, so too did the Emperor Ashoka of India have connections to the wealthy Jews of Alexandria. There were well-known Jewish cities in the area, such as Kerala, which acted as an outpost for Jewish influence, with cities like Alexandria being the center of Jewish influence as it spread outwards. When Ashoka died, his empire ended up collapsing, with his population revolting at these spiritual practices. This ended up seeing a return of authentic, Vedic Aryan practices for a while, before they were ultimately subverted for the final time, creating what would now be known as modern Buddhism. There's a lot that could be said about the subject, but in short, the core corruption of these Eastern teachings comes from this pacifistic idea that you need to remove yourself from the world, from the material plane. This includes becoming indifferent to suffering, foregoing all attachments, losing all desires, as well as regarding the flesh and the physical world as being evil. This includes taking a vow of poverty, vows of celibacy, and other such things. As you can see, this already resembles exactly what is taught in Christianity. In many ways, Buddhism was the Christianity of the East. It's not surprising that both of these religions have a common Jewish link, albeit Buddhism not being exactly an Abrahamic school. Other strange beliefs found in this Buddhism include the idea that, to achieve nirvana, you must dissolve your very soul by dissolving the karmic glue that keeps your soul together. Only by destroying the very last vestiges of yourself, your individuality, your ego, and your soul, will you achieve true bliss. Only when your existence ends, will suffering end, and you will find peace, according to these Buddhists. In other words, simply existing is suffering, but you shouldn't do anything to improve your situation. In fact, this line of thinking argues that no matter what you do, it's hopeless. You don't need to think too long about this to realize this is essentially a type of death cult. The ultimate culmination of this philosophy is the death, destruction, demoralization, and annihilation of life. Do you think that destroying your soul is a good thing? Or do you think that this is the kind of stuff that the Kabbalistic rabbis would laugh their asses off at? Look at these stupid goyim destroying their souls thinking this is actually good for them. This kind of idea, this attachment to the concept of nothingness, becoming nothingness itself, dissolving your soul, losing any individuality, is a core aspect of most right-hand path systems. You can find this influence spread across Taoism, Daoism, and most other types of Eastern systems. As such, it's no surprise that the Indian populace ended up being subjugated under Islamic invasion after centuries of pacifist, corrupted Buddhist indoctrination. Of course, there are some small, secret groups that reject this, and focus on genuine spiritual practices that empower the soul and immortalize it. This includes the diamond body, rainbow body teachings of various Tibetan groups. However, these have always been forced to remain underground, oftentimes, quite literally. There are documentaries that prove that these groups had to hide in underground mountain caves and passages, establishing hidden libraries away from civilization in order to keep these true spiritual traditions secure. But that's another topic altogether. Putting aside the historical context, when you look at the right-hand path, you see this type of pacifistic, anti-materialistic idea all over the place in these traditions. Whether that's rejecting sex, becoming a vegetarian, vegan, starving yourself to achieve bliss and enlightenment, rejecting the world, taking a vow of poverty, etc., all this stuff does is to make you as weak and servile as possible. Genuine spirituality should make you strong, make you empowered, improve your life, as well as your people, or Volk, and eventually, the world itself? These teachings just make you a weak little slave. Exactly what the Jews want. Even the right-hand path practitioners and more secret occult societies, that end up cultivating true powers, hardly end up doing anything to improve the world with these abilities. Often, they just meditate on a mountain for the rest of their lives. In other words, they don't do anything to fight against the Jew world order. In this regard, the Kabbalistic rabbis are ecstatic, a potential rival to their powers doing nothing meaningful with their life to fight against them. I hope you can see now how both the left-hand path and the right-hand path are a false dichotomy. They are the occult equivalent of the Republican and Democrat Party, both are false and already corrupted by the Jews. True Aryan spirituality, just like true Aryan politics, comes from a third position. Something that takes the best from both sides, but rejects the Talmudic taint and poison laced within these positions. If you want true Aryan spirituality, look no further than what we saw in World War II. The Thule and Vril societies in Germany, the Green Dragon Society in Japan, the Tibetan Yellow Hats in Tibet. These are all groups that advocated non-Jewish occult practices, cultivating the soul, forging genuine connections with Aryan spiritual powers. Most importantly, these groups all stress the importance of effecting change on the physical world as well, defeating the Jews once and for all, and bringing back the golden age of humanity. If you liked this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Also, check out some of my other works and documentaries. I plan to cover these topics in much more detail in the near future. Until then, hail victory! The White Mage, Hyperborean Research.